Hello and welcome everyone to a review of Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, the 5th expansion for the MMO, which increases the level cap to 100, adds female Hrothgars, and 2 new DPS classes. With the game now in its second decade, or well into its second decade if you count 1.0, Dawntrail will act as a soft reboot for the series. God of War 2018 did something similar, and films such as Star Wars The Force Awakens, Jurassic World, and Mad Max Fury Road also come to mind. They all keep the established timeline as canon, but they take the story in a different direction, either with new characters, new villains, or a new overarching storyline. With Endwalker mostly wrapping up everything in a neat little package, Dawntrail will serve as the springboard to usher in the next decade of expansions to come. When compared to A Realm Reborn, I believe Dawntrail does a better job as a starting point, but it still has plenty of flaws. What we do get is a new world and a brand new story, but all the characters that we've come to know and love still exist, even if it doesn't feel like it sometimes. It takes about 50 hours to finish Dawntrail's story, but if you decide to skip cutscenes, then your playthrough will be shorter. This video will cover the sights, the sounds, the pacing, the main story, and the overall feel of the new dungeons, trials, and raids, but it won't go into any details about the job classes or fight specifics. So let's start off with a look at the graphics. I'll keep this brief because while the changes are nice, it's not something I feel like I need to analyze in depth. Notably, your character will be among the first recipients of a drastic makeover, with improved skin, hair, and eyes. All of the new content will have better lighting, better shadows, and better textures, especially on fabrics and armor. However, older gear won't receive texture updates until future patches. It isn't perfect, however, as a few shadows still don't react correctly to certain lighting, and hair clipping through gear still remains an issue, but everything else is leagues better than anything that's come before. The graphical update isn't exclusive for the new expansion either, with older zones already benefiting from the improved lighting. This is especially noticeable when you look at the shiny bits on the main stage at the Gold Saucer. In addition, a second dye channel has been added to select gear, so you now have even more options for customization. The team hopes to implement this on all dyeable gear by patch 7.4, and I expect this feature to only get better once the team gets more experience working on the improved glamour system. Overall, I have nothing but positive things to say about the new graphics. Another positive before we get into the not so great stuff is the music. Final Fantasy has always been known for its music, and this is no exception. The soundtrack fits the new zones really well, and the dungeon music was exceptional. Dawntrail's music is on par with the previous expansions, which is a very high bar, so no complaints here. Actually, there is one minor complaint upon reflection, and that was the Smile song. However, the biggest improvement for me was that Dawntrail finally replaced most of the A Realm Reborn music that would play during cutscenes, so that's a major plus as I was getting tired of hearing that music. It's a change that signifies we truly are in a new story arc, which is nice. As we move on to the other sounds, the English voice acting, on the other hand, was a letdown, and that was not something I was expecting to say. It wasn't terrible, but it doesn't match the quality of the previous expansions, and there were some inconsistencies that bugged me a lot. So let's first talk about Wuklamot. Since she has the most lines out of anyone, it's only right we talk about her first. She had some good moments, but she also had moments that were really hard to listen to. Her line delivery and dialogue during the final fight is so bad that every time I get that trial, I inch ever closer to hitting that mute button. It's a fun fight, but by that point I don't want to listen to her anymore. Her performance was okay on average, but with such wildly varying quality for the main character, that's simply not good enough. In fact, it's bad. To be fair, the script also needed a few more drafts, and it's not just her, so it makes me wonder if the voice actors were given enough direction. Moving on to some other characters, Kryle's voice actress was one of the few that stood out to me, and it was a bright spot in an otherwise cacophony of mediocrity. Aaronville's accent is so thick and was so different from his mother's that it makes no sense, and his R's irked me. Accent notwithstanding, I think he did an okay job. Y'shtola's audio quality, on the other hand, was terrible. I know it's not the voice actress's fault because we've heard it before, but rather an issue with the recording equipment or software. It sounds crackly, and having her volume lower than everyone else is a poor attempt to mask the terrible recording. Thancred also had a few lines that sounded strange, but nothing to the degree of Y'shtola. The rest of the Scions mostly did a fine job, but they had so few lines that it doesn't even matter. Outside of a few characters, the voice acting in Dawntrail is a huge step down in quality. 4 out of 10 for the voice acting. Moving on to the meat of the game, the pacing of the story is where it gets even more dicey, and the more I think about it, the more upset I become. The story was broken up into 2 acts, which is fine, I have no issues with that, but the pacing was about as consistent as a poorly maintained roller coaster ride. There was a lot of reading, and most of it didn't matter. I understand this is a brand new adventure, so the first act needs time to get going, but the quests were boring, unengaging, and time-consuming busy work, aka fetch quests and talking to people. It did an okay job building up the world, but did a poor job developing the characters. I understand not everything can be full gas, and there are times we need to slow things down, but some parts full on put me to sleep. The transition into the second act was particularly ungraceful as well, and many of the issues in the first act are still present here. There were some really intense moments, but they were sandwiched by boring ass parts. I shouldn't be yawning during a game, let alone during the second half when things should be ramping up. For example, Shaloni and Living Memory were 2 of the slowest and most boring parts of the game. These zones were the beginning and end of the second act respectively. Shaloni had some of the most forgettable characters, and the quests in that region felt like anime filler content, and it didn't have any impact on the story whatsoever. This was my least favorite part of the game. I don't care about Zekua or the crooked deputy sheriff. This time could have been better spent on developing important characters, such as the villains. More on that later. The latter, Living Memory, at least had some great characters, but they were shortchanged when it comes to screen time, and these were things that should have been resolved earlier. Perhaps replacing the parts where we're talking to farmers about their high-tech sprinklers. The reason I rate Living Memory low is because while it was great for character development, it had no action whatsoever. As a reminder, this was the final zone and I'm at max level. I should have been brimming with excitement, but there was almost no build up to the finale, and there was no sense of urgency that would indicate that we were heading into the final battle. Instead, they made us do fetch quests all the way to level 100, and it killed my experience. The terrible pacing of pivotal moments like these dragged the story down, and it was somehow even worse than Endwalker's pacing. 4 out of 10. When it comes to the story, I like the doors it opens for us to explore in the future, but that doesn't help the present situation. Dawntrail had a lot of potential, and you could see where the story could be improved, but it uncharacteristically falters when it comes to the storytelling and writing. A hero is only as good as their villains, and as alluded to earlier, Woklamat's villains were severely underdeveloped, and her getting as much screen time as she did only highlighted how poorly written a lot of the characters were, not just her. I didn't have a reason to care about the villains, nor did I feel any remorse for having to fight them, and subsequently this made Woklamat a weaker character. Another major change in the story's direction was the decision to focus on Woklamat. Naturally, since she's the main character, you're relegated to being a supporting character, and the Scions who are once your supporting cast have been demoted to unpaid extras. Simply reducing her overbearing presence would have alleviated many of the problems I had with Dawntrail's story, because that time could have been spent on characters that desperately needed it. To be clear, I don't think the concept of being a side character is a bad thing, because it gave us the chance to explore new storylines, meet new people, and this was the fastest way to get to know Woklamat, who we've only just met. However, having said that, they wasted that opportunity with terrible quest design. Too many quests revolved around talking to random strangers and then reporting back to Woklamat, followed by a fetch quest only to repeat this process again and again. We hardly got to play the game. And while on the subject of Woklamat, I didn't think she would remain the main character for the entire game. The second act would have been the perfect opportunity to shift the focus back onto us, the player. So, while I don't think they made a bad decision to shine the spotlight on Wook-Lamont, I do think it was the wrong choice to keep it on her. As for the Scions, this also doesn't mean they can't have a bigger role in the future. So I still think they made the right decision to use them sparingly, but when they did use them, those storylines were squandered. Kryl, for one, despite having a great reason for exploring the new world, didn't get the time she deserved. And a clash with a certain pair of Scions seemed almost inevitable when we found out they were recruited by our rival. In fact, they seemed eager to test their mettle against us, and I would have been happy to oblige in a friendly bout. But that storyline was never taken to its logical conclusion, so my anticipation fizzled into nothing, and it was a huge letdown. And that's been the theme for Dawntrail. There was so much potential in this story that was sadly never realized, and it leaves you wanting more. After squandering just about every opportunity for greatness and robbing us of potentially awesome moments, Dawntrail's story was a bit of a disappointment. It started off well enough, and I really liked Wook-Lamont, but after a certain point, my opinion of her slowly degraded as the story progressed. What put me over the edge from liking her to being annoyed with her was when she barged into the final fight. She should never have been able to join, and that should have been my moment to shine. Still, I don't hate her as a character, but she's on very thin ice. But with all that said, despite the story not being great, I feel like it could still be redeemed. The new world is great, and there are other storylines and characters that haven't been mucked up just yet. There were a couple of very vague teasers at the end, and it seemed like they wanted to leave it open while they decide where to take the story, which could be a concern, but I still have hope they can pull it together. Unfortunately, none of this can change what has already been written, so how much enjoyment you'll get from Dawntrail is directly tied to how much you like Wook-Lamont as a character, and it's hard to say how much you'll like her by the end. This is her expansion, and we're just along for the ride, but the story is just part of what the game has to offer, so even if you don't love the story, the rest of the game may have something that appeals to you. The story had some great moments and explored some interesting topics, but was told very poorly. It's a 5 out of 10 for me. The other half I want to touch on is the dungeons, trials, and endgame raids. In this respect, not much has changed in terms of fundamentals, but the combat instances were well designed, provide a decent challenge, and have some great music. With the addition of 2 new damage dealing classes, there should be something for everyone, though we might be getting to the point where we have too many classes. If you were able to clear everything up until now, then Dawntrail shouldn't pose a significant challenge. While there are some new mechanics, and it is a step up in terms of difficulty, I'd argue it's the shock factor that will get most people on their first few attempts. After you grow accustomed to the new animations and choreography, it's more or less the same as before. However, one downside is Dawntrail feels like it lacks content during the main story. There weren't enough quests where we actually got to play, it was just a lot of talking. In terms of the number of dungeons and trials we got, it's on par with the previous expansions, but since this is the start of a new arc, I think they should have added more to help build the foundation for the next 10 years worth of story. Make Dawntrail a bit more like A Realm Reborn in this respect. Because there were so few dungeons and trials, the spacing between them was not great, especially when they're separated by 2 entire levels of dialogue and fetch quests. I really felt the dead air after Vanguard, when we were taking on not 1 but 2 boring ass tours, then did a bunch of those talk to 3 strangers quests, and then all of a sudden was hit by the next dungeon and trial back to back. I think this holds doubly true for the trials, because having only 2 trials during our entire leveling process sucked. I think Dawntrail should have added a couple more trials to make it feel more substantial. Since dungeons and trials are only on odd levels, why not give something to the even levels as well? It doesn't have to be as meaty as a dungeon, but I feel like those in-between levels need something. I fear Creative Studio 3 played it way too safe, and the formula they've been using up until now needed a shakeup as the structure has become too predictable. I say this all in hindsight, of course. The endgame content is pretty sparse, as it generally is at the beginning of an expansion, but what we got so far was great. I just wish we got a little more. The raids are a standout feature, and they are very fun with a nice tie-in to the story. The audio design was also superb, having dynamic callouts for things that happened during the encounter. However, the raid quest cutscenes still aren't voice acted, which is a bummer. If you enjoy the challenge of the content and like grabbing the latest and greatest gear, then I think Dawntrail excels in this department. If these early raids and trials are any indication, then I think players have a lot to look forward to in future content patches. While Dawntrail does initially entice players with a new world, its weaker story is not what I've come to expect from the series. Dawntrail's story focuses heavily on the game's new protagonist Wook Lamont without much consideration for the supporting cast or antagonists, and its storytelling suffers for it. Like Endwalker, the pacing of the game remains an issue, but without an interesting story like what Endwalker had, it made my playthrough rather unenjoyable. With quests favoring dialogue-heavy cutscenes and fetch quests over engaging gameplay and combat, Square Enix will need to rethink their quest designs moving forward. While Dawntrail leaves enough open avenues for potentially interesting storylines for the future, Dawntrail's own storytelling leaves much to be desired. Structurally, it's an iterative expansion that follows a formula that's been working for the developers for the past decade, but they have failed to tell a captivating tale with that formula this time. The voice acting is another notable low point, as the quality and direction was not up to their usual standard. However, voice acting also can't make up for the poor writing. Where the game shines, however, is in the fun and challenging dungeons, trials, and raids, but I wish we got more of it during the main story. The new visuals have no effect on the score, but it is certainly nice to look at. The music is stellar, but is really trying its hardest to not be dragged down with the story. To make things a bit clearer, I'll have separate scores. The gameplay gets a respectable 7.5 out of 10, while the story and storytelling gets a shockingly low 5 out of 10. There were a lot of ups and downs, which I'd argue is better than a straight 5. I think that would have been even more boring. But even though Dawntrail falters in its storytelling and writing, it's still a decent stepping stone for the next decade to come, because it opened a lot of doors, and I for one will be keeping an eye out for what they do next. But like A Realm Reborn, I don't want to go through that story ever again. While it likely won't receive universal acclaim like its predecessors, they haven't done anything so egregious that can't be fixed with some good post-content patches and a bit of elbow grease. But if you're wondering whether or not Dawntrail is worth buying and playing for the story alone, I would say no, not in its current state with the writers having no clear goal in mind. I would advise waiting for future content patches or possibly the next expansion before deciding whether or not it's worth trudging through Dawntrail. All of this is assuming you've completed everything up until Dawntrail. If you haven't, then it's absolutely worth playing up until the end of Endwalker. And don't forget about the free trial if you just want to dip your toes in. Thank you so much for watching. What did you think of Dawntrail? If you enjoyed it, then I'm happy for you. Remember, these are just my opinions and I'm not saying yours are wrong. If you're interested in seeing more videos, subscribe and let me know down below. Till next time, see ya.